right, I have 6:30, so we'll get started. Welcome everyone to the Monroeville Literary Festival, our first ever virtual event. We're very pleased that you could join us tonight and hope that if you're watching this tonight and have never visited Monroeville, or you're watching this in the future, that you'll come and see us sometime. The Monroeville Literary Festival is a project of Coastal Alabama Community College. It is made possible by funding from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Alabama State Council on the Arts. Sponsors include the Georgia Pacific Foundation, George Landegger, and Diane Lawson Baker, who is very pivotal in funding the award that is being granted tonight. So thank you all for attending, and I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Don Noble.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed a fine dinner, even though sadly we could not enjoy it all together in Monroeville. Each year it is my pleasure and honor to present the Truman Capote Prize to a writer who has produced distinguished work in either the short story or literary nonfiction. The Capote Prize is relatively new and is made possible through the generosity of Mrs. Diane Baker of Tuscaloosa, avid reader and supporter of the arts. For many years, I believe that the other literary genius of Monroeville was unjustly ignored. Capote was a prince of the language and a highly productive writer, publishing more than 18 books in many genres, not counting collected letters, stories, and magazine pieces and posthumously published fiction. In his early years, Capote was the most celebrated short story writer in the country, stunning readers with the ghostly story Miriam and the comic My Side of the Matter. His novels, especially Breakfast at Tiffany's and Other Voices, Other Rooms, were huge successes. His reportage of the Porgy and Bess Theater Company tour of the Soviet Union, The Muses Are Heard, is as fresh today as it was decades ago. He was a master interviewer, often beguiling the subject, like Marlon Brando, into revealing more than he had intended to. For Broadway, Capote adopted his own story, The Grass Harp, and then wrote the book and music, turning his story, House of Flowers, into a musical starring Pearl Bailey and Diane Carroll. Capote wrote screenplays, adapting Henry James's The Turn of the Screw, which starred Deborah Carr and Michael Redgrave, and writing Beat the Devil for John Huston. Not a recluse, Capote appeared on the movie screen and with mixed but memorable results on late night TV shows like Johnny Carson. All the world knows In Cold Blood, book and movie, and it is still arguable that Capote invented a new and different hybrid species of fiction. Since the Harper Lee Award is given usually to an author of novels or poetry, I decided to focus the Capote Prize on short fiction and nonfiction. The 5 previous winners are Bart Barton, Michael Knight, and Michelle Richmond for short fiction, Charles Gaines and B.J. Hollers for nonfiction. This year's winner is a writer well known to generations of Alabama writing students. Mr. Alan Wier taught at Tuscaloosa for 14 years. Now, after retiring from UT Knoxville, he has returned to live out his many remaining days on Lake Guntersville. Besides his stories, Wier has published several novels, and they reveal a disturbing trend. Here is Blanco, 1978, which occupied 209 pages in a volume it shared with Things About to Disappear, a collection of stories. Here is Departing as Air, 1983, a sensible 201 pages. But here is Tejano, 2006, a novel of the American West, the larger-than-life, sprawling American West. which runs 714 pages and cannot be held by the week. One might ask, given this trend, what next? These are fine novels, but Wier today is receiving the Capote Prize for his splendid work in short fiction. There was, as mentioned, the collection Things About to Disappear. But over the years, Wier has steadily written and published stories in the most prestigious literary journals in the country. The Southern Review, Greensboro, Texas, Idaho, and Georgia Reviews, Carolina Quarterly, Shenandoah, everywhere that counts. These stories, many of them collected in the recently published Late Night, Early Morning, have been praised lovingly, extravagantly, not just by literary critics, but also by Alan Wier's peers. Robert Morgan writes of his mastery. Jill McCorkle finds the stories rich and lyrical. Robert Olin Butler remarks on their power and brilliance. Steve Yarborough calls Wier the consummate craftsman. Bobby Ann Mason lauds his dazzling prose style. There are many, many others. Wier's achievements over the years have not gone unrewarded. He has received grants from the NEA, the Guggenheim Foundation, and Arts Commissions of Texas and Tennessee. He is the winner of the John Dos Passos Prize and the Robert Penn Warren Award, and now the Truman Capote Prize. A word about the physical prize itself. In his later years, Capote had several homes in Switzerland, New York City, the Hamptons, even Palm Springs, and moved restlessly from one to the next. He always took with him his collection of paperweights in a specially constructed case. He would take them out, arrange them on his desk, and then he felt at home and he could write. His favorite was a crystal, a gift from the French writer Colette. The physical memento of the Capote Prize is therefore a crystal paperweight from, of course, Tiffany's. I am now handing this crystal paperweight to Alan Wier, who will receive it and show it to you.
Good. Very proud.
There you are. Ladies and gentlemen, wherever you may be, join me in welcoming this year's Capote Prize winner, Mr. Alan Wier.
Thank you, Don. Don wrote a review of Late Night, Early Morning, and it made me realize, you know, it's gratifying just to be read, but it's especially gratifying to be well read. And I think many of the audience know that Don created the Capote Prize and he chairs the selection committee. And I'm grateful for the time and energy he spends promoting the literary arts in Alabama. The Capote Prize, as Don said, is sponsored by Diane Lawson Baker, and I'm very appreciative for her support. Thanks to Coastal Alabama Community College for sponsoring the Monroeville Literary Festival, and to Alicia Lynham and many others who worked to make the festival successful. Finally, thanks to those of you who are with us this evening, this virtual presentation. I'm privileged to be here with all of you. The Capote Prize is especially meaningful to me because it goes to a writer with strong connections to the state of Alabama. A native Texan, I first came to Alabama in the fall of 1980 when I began teaching at the university. I met my wife, Donnie, in Tuscaloosa. There I met my stepsons, Heath and Mike. Donnie and I have a son, Wes, who was born there. But I always assumed that one day I would return to the Texas Hill Country. When I retired from the University of Tennessee, Donnie corrected that assumption. We've been back in Alabama, in Gunnersville, for almost 10 years. And I'm very proud to be recognized in my adopted state. The previous recipients whom Don mentioned, Marlon Barton, Michael Knight, Michelle Richmond, B.J. Hollers, and Charles Gaines, are all writers whose work I genuinely admire. So I'm honored to join that prestigious company. And it's also an honor to have my name linked to Truman Capote, a significantly innovative writer. I think his influence can still be seen in the continuing development and popularity of creative nonfiction. My first encounter with Capote was as a freshman in English class at Baylor University in Texas, where I read A Tree of Night and then A Christmas Memory. Later, when I was in grad school, his innovative and his haunting nonfiction novel, In Cold Blood, opened my eyes to the imaginative possibilities of crossing or blending genres. When I was teaching at Alabama, I almost met Capote, and I came even closer to talking with him on the phone. Capote was enthusiastic about being the keynote speaker at a homecoming event on campus. We'd invited all the writers we knew of who had ever studied at the University of Alabama. That afternoon of the evening that was to feature Capote, he phoned asking to speak to me. Those of you who know me know that we pronounce our name Wier. Mr. Capote called for Mr. Wier, which was a dead giveaway. Donnie and I weren't married at the time. She was working in the English department, and she took the call. Capote's flight was delayed by fog. Flight delays continued until it was pretty clear he wasn't going to make it to Alabama. The head of the department suggested that I give a reading and fill in for Truman Capote. I knew better than to go before an audience expecting Capote, so I suggested that we get various alums to read from their work, and that passed muster. Now, Donnie sometimes reminds me that she talked with Truman Capote, but now I can point to this certificate of award, and there's my name right by Capote's, not to mention the crystal paperweight that I showed earlier from Tiffany and Company, of course. Oscar Wilde describes fiction writing as the telling of beautiful, untrue things, which is a pretty definition of lying. The storyteller's touch falsifies life. Real life is lived, at least in part, through make-believe images. And faced with a listener's waning attention, many of us resort to exaggeration or even a little honest fabrication. I don't know why Donnie doesn't appreciate that, but she still interrupts stories I tell, questioning facts that I've intentionally improved upon. Donnie is a painter who has the gift of portraiture, and she does not question clients when they bring her different photographs and say, paint my daughter with these eyes, but paint on this smile and these arms. And I remind her that, like a portrait, a story is an illusion that may distort the facts to reveal the truth. So I present myself this evening as a professional liar. In many ways, I am more daunted by the demands of writing a short story than by those of writing a novel. Seldom a man of few words, I like how a novel may allow digressions for their own sake. But as master storyteller Anton Chekhov says, if you cut a good story anywhere, it will bleed. When I began the practice of story writing, and it remains a practice aimed at unobtainable perfection, Truman Capote was one of the short story writers I most admired. By omitting the names of the narrator, called only Buddy, and of his older cousin in A Christmas Memory, Capote first helped me see that what a writer chooses to leave out may be just as important as what a writer includes in a story. The first of my stories that I want to read from was written in an effort to expunge part of my grief over the loss of my daddy, who had died just weeks before I began writing Things About to Disappear. The narrator is leaving Texas, where his father has just been buried. On the road ahead of him, he witnesses a one-car accident, a metaphor for the wreckage his father became in his battle with cancer. Though the story is about the father's death, I omitted most of the details about that and used the car wreck as a parallel association to convey the narrator's feelings about his father, even when the father is absent from the page. Here are the first couple of pages of things about to disappear. After 9 months of sickness, slipping away from us a little more every day, my daddy died. The cancer got an artery, it burst, and he went out in a rush. We buried him on a windy limestone hill beneath a twisted live oak. It was a time of leaving, the tail end of a sad summer. He was gone and I was going, leaving Texas again. I drove east. The air through the car windows like the outdoor side of a window air conditioner, and I smelled the wet air, sticky East Texas hot. I'd already left one landscape behind. In the few hours I'd been driving, white caliche dirt had turned red. Rugged hills had smoothed out, gotten more civilized, more used looking. Brown grass had gone green, and every mile the trees got taller and straighter. I'd been through Buffalo, Tucker, Palestine, Ironton, Jacksonville. I'd crossed the Trinity River way south of Trinidad, where I used to cross. Used to pass the Pink Motel, all alone at the end of the narrow old bridge, and the fertilizer plant, nearly hidden in live oaks on the other side of the river. Once I had told a friend the Trinidad fertilizer plant was really a secret laboratory where strange beings from another world were collecting and processing human blood for their dying race. The aliens had taken human form and lived in the Pink Motel. The tall, futuristic-looking water towers were really full of blood. The boxcars on the railroad siding brought in bodies. The brown smoke was from burning flesh. My friend and I made a secret pact. If one of us ever needed the other, all he had to do was send a note. Trinidad aliens, midnight, December 12th. We would never forget. And now I don't even have an address to send the note to. And they've widened the highway at Trinidad, torn down the scary, wonderful old bridge, and cut out most of the live oaks that used to make the fertilizer plant so mysterious, a secret alien laboratory. After the Trinity, I crossed the Neches. Not enough water in the Neches to make one good tear. I left it behind, dry, waiting for water forever, for all I knew. I had 2 rivers left, 2 rivers more I knew, Little Angelina, the Sabine. The sun was in the west in the rear view mirror, sundown behind me and darkness coming ahead of me. Lights on in New York, dinner dishes done in Washington. Drive-in movies dancing on in small towns all over Virginia, if you could see that far ahead. As the road rose and fell in the piney hills, I held and lost that last summer sun. Leave taking. I was playing it to the hilt. The tires were whining up and down the hills like a pedal steel guitar. All the old sad songs about leaving were running like an old slow record in my head. And I was holding the names of places sweet in my mouth, shaping them with my lips and feeling their flavor like hard candy on my tongue. Melodies of names, names like Dripping Springs, Round Mountain, Marble Falls, Spicewood, Calf Creek, Air. names that echoed when I thought them: San Saba, Cherry Spring, Mountain Home, Morris Ranch, Stonewall, Blanco, and the name of the man who had left me, the man I was leaving behind. His name I could not speak, and the name that rhymed with breath and was forever. Now there were warning signs, and all down one side of the highway were bright orange tags on tall pine trees, tags the color of sunset, and then no trees at all, just a wide red gash and the dark fingers of stubborn stumps and silent orange earth movers parked in the mud. I topped a hill, and a slow black car appeared in front of me, weaving back and forth, shoulder to shoulder, covering the whole road. I couldn't see through the glare of the last crack of sun caught on the rear window and flashing as the car careened back and forth in front of me. I honked my horn and flashed my lights, but the car meandered on like the dry riverbed of the Neches. Then, sudden as a dream, the car jerked left, shot off the shoulder, and went through a sawhorse barricade where new lanes were being built over a ditch. Broken boards flew up over me like puppets yanked off a stage, and the car shot out onto a new white slab and up into the air, like one of the spaceships I'd imagined the aliens landed at Trinidad. And the car stopped there in the air, nose up. And that second caught and held for me like the car held in air. And I saw all these things: a bird gliding just before it dives, a kite the second its string breaks, a falling leaf, a thrown stick, a fish jumping and caught in the sun, a balsa wood plane at the end of a dip or turn, a man shot out of a circus cannon, a pole vaulter, high jumper, hurdler, held in air, its lips puckered, muscles tensed, eyes closed, suspended over a bar. Wooden rocker runners tipped almost vertical, the crest of a wave curling back like a horn into itself, and a last breath held, maybe forever. And the car rolled slowly over and fell gracelessly across the ditch, hitting the soft mud with an ugly sound, someone breaking wind, a boil lanced, nose blown, phlegm spat. The windshield popped out whole and shot like a clipped fingernail across the ditch. And I was caught there, dead still on the road. A friend who knew of my father's illness and death asked if I had, in real life, encountered a car wreck such as the one in the story. When I said that yes, I had, my friend asked, what makes my story fiction instead of nonfiction? For one thing, I told her, the car wreck happened 10 years before my dad got sick. Literary worlds aren't always chronological. Sometimes they're parallel. Having witnessed the accident, the narrator has to decide whether to stop and render aid or first find a house where he can stop and use a telephone to call an ambulance. Not too long ago, I read that story, and then the audience was invited to ask questions. Almost immediately, a young man lifted and waved his hand. He wanted to know why my character did not use his cell phone to call for help. And I had to explain that the story and I predate cell phones. I had fun putting a very private joke in that story. As an undergraduate, I had an unlikable modern poetry professor who enjoyed citing writing rules that I found condescending. Once, he pronounced, that one may never in English verse rhyme breath with death. My sentence, quote, and the name that rhymed with breath and was forever, is my little refutation of his absolutism. Later in that class, when we discussed Robert Penn Warren's Ode to the Confederate Dead, that same professor said, as an aside, no writer of any worth would write of brothers fighting on opposite sides of the American Civil War. In my 19th century novel, Tejano, I made up characters who are identical twin brothers who fight on opposite sides of the Civil War. Inspiration is where you find it, right? So next I want to read a story, read from a story that I wrote after I read a newspaper article about a woman in Birmingham who asked to legally adopt a dead infant left at the front door of an orphanage. She gave the unknown baby her name, and she used her entire savings to pay for its funeral and its headstone. My story is told from the point of view of an elderly bachelor who lives alone with no family and no friends. This scene takes place a few pages into A Need for Grief. In robe and slippers, Emery folded up the newspaper and used it like a potholder to carry the cat's litter box to the back alley. The cat followed like a dog, and Emery almost stepped on it twice, pushing it out of the way the second time with a soft kick that pitched it out onto the damp morning grass. Arching like a Halloween cat, it leapt onto the squares of slate that led from the back door to the alley fence. Emery hoped the squeak of the gate wouldn't wake any of his neighbors. The older he got, the earlier he gave up on sleep. Trying to be quiet, Emery slowly lifted the lid of his garbage can. From here, across his backyard, the light he had left on in his kitchen was a bright rectangle, deep yellow, the color of an apple core in the pile of garbage. He had no memory of eating that apple. He flipped the litter box over, tapped on the bottom, and hard bits of clay showered down into the garbage, a splattering like rain falling. And Emery looked up for clouds. There they were, ahead of the sun, moving like waves, dark gray with white-capped edges drowning the morning light. Down both sides of the alley, houses were still dark. The small windows, squares of gray, revealed nothing inside the houses, reflected nothing outside. Windows he could see, but could not see through. Down both sides of the alley, garbage cans, cardboard boxes, plastic garbage bags were set and stacked for collection. Across the alley, directly behind Emery's house, a floor lamp with a fluted shade and a spherical bottom stuck up out of a cardboard box. The tall black iron lamp, giving no light, looked like an exclamation point, something from a cartoon typed against the storm cloud darkness before dawn. Tilting back the lamp, Emery found a bundle of wrinkled blouses and a straw dog bed with a plaid pillow bottom that looked perfectly new. He picked up the pillow, wondering if the cat would sleep in a basket, and found a stack of old photographs and a Lone Ranger mask that needed only one end of the elastic headband fastened back in place. The same dark-haired woman appeared in all the photos. In every pose, she wore the same white dress and stood or sat on the same dark lawn beside the same dark tree in front of the same white house. This was not the tan brick house before Emery now. One photograph had caught the sun. Emery looked up, but no sun penetrated the dark, cloudy sky. A bright spot blanked out the woman's face, radiated from the center of the picture where she looked up from a mown smooth lawn. The skirt of her dress spread around her in a perfect circle, so she appeared to have no legs. The woman's empty hands rested palms up in her lap. Emery stared at this picture for what seemed like a long time, searching for the woman's expression in the blur of light. Letting the photograph slide back into the big box, he turned to walk back to his house when his sheepskin slipper towed a brown plastic leaf bag wedged between the box of trash and two garbage cans. He pushed at the bag with his foot. It felt solid and was wedged firmly against the box, the plastic tight against whatever it contained, stretched thin over angles, bulging, swollen. Emery took the bag by the gathered plastic end where yellow drawstrings knotted tight, and he lifted it into the top of an open metal garbage can. The bag slowly split open, the flat plastic peeling apart, separating smoothly down a seam, magically almost, as if an invisible hand had pulled an invisible silent zipper. Plastic pieces, cold and sticky, curled over Emery's fingers. Out of the bottom of the bag slid the body of an infant, the smooth bottoms of tiny feet sticking up toward the cloudy sky, the small head tipped backward into the garbage can. Emery stared at his knuckle. He let his eyes go out of focus, let the body he was seeing blur into a bulge of light. Two white hairs, no more than a quarter of an inch long, grew out of his finger. The hairs crossed and uncrossed in the movement of air that was too delicate to call a breeze. The tiny hairs touched, and he almost heard them hit, a sword fight, the ringing and vibration of steel on steel, the dull sting of realization. With an effort that was physical, he forced his eyes to refocus on the small corpse. Torn pieces of plastic stuck to the ends of his fingers, like the fingertips of rubber gloves. He unwrapped the body, the plastic rattling like distant thunder. The skin was damp and slick, and the little naked body almost slid out of his hands. He lifted it close. The dark eyes were clouded over, tiny lashes matted together. Under the nose, some liquid had dried, clear and shiny. The full lips were dark, almost blue. The upper lip curled against skin beneath the nose, and hanging on the dark underside of the lip like a fat tick was a brown bubble of dried blood. Behind one small knee, Emery brushed away a wedge of coffee grounds. Cradling the small body that had become weightless in his arms, he silently passed back through the alley gateway, and as he went up the slate walk to his house, the baby's arms bent at the elbows and stretched out and softly bounced. Empty as the arms of a doll, they jiggled and swayed, as if the baby were still alive and might laugh and reach, groping for Emery's finger, which stuck out stiffly from the side of the small head held firmly in Emery's hand. Now I want to read from The Ruler of the Elves, a story that I shaped from similar material in one of my novels, A Place for Outlaws. Now, there's nothing new in a writer using similar material in different forms, but I was surprised by how difficult it was to compress scenes in a novel into a standalone short story. I once asked the late George Garrett, whose short stories amaze me every time I reread them, why he had the same character appearing in several different stories. I expected George to say he had not exhausted the possibilities of that character. But George said, and I quote, "Sometimes a character is not yet through with the writer." Like the first excerpt I read from Things About to Disappear, this story was also informed by my experience of my father's dying. I imagined the ruler of the Elves from the point of view of a dying man's wife. And this excerpt is from late in the story. The first time Avery asked Julia to help him get a bath, he was nervous. He was afraid of her husband's wasted body, his weakness. He was afraid for him to see her fear. He bent to lift him from the bed and got a whiff of the baby powder he sprinkled on his back every evening. He was shocked by how light the body was. Cradled in her arms, Emery's spine and the backs of his thighs felt no heavier and no thicker than broomsticks, pool cues. It was like lifting a child. This body had held her as no other body had or ever would. This man had been her lover, her partner, her strength. For a moment, their eyes could not avoid meeting. He hated for Avery to see her see him like this. Samson, with all his strength gone. He lowered his body until his sallow, skeletal feet, the pale yellow, ropey feet of a bird, touched the tile floor. Though he was inches taller than she, the pain kept him in a constant crouch, his knees drawn up while his shoulders sank downward to meet them. In the mirror on the back of the bathroom door, Julia watched the two of them, husband and wife, in a last slow waltz. Julia knelt on one knee, and the man who had been her husband reached out and gripped her shoulder to steady himself. Avery's red robe, he had insisted on a bright red robe to be sick in, was draped over his shoulders regally. His sweat-dampened hair stuck up in points like a crown. Julia knelt before this quickly aged Avery as a loyal subject before an elderly sovereign in some ceremony of knighthood or blessing. When Avery's robe fell away, so did Julia's self-consciousness. There was no embarrassment between them, only an unspoken acceptance of what little could be done. Julia moved the bar of soap down the orange iodine stain faintly visible on Avery's neck. The soap bar bumped over his bony shoulder and down his clearly visible rib cage. He soaked the purple scars that zigzagged like lightning down his chest and across his side. Avery looked down at himself and then up at Julia. He was grinning. He held his thin middle finger out, and in the oily rainbow the soap left on the surface of the water, he traced the shape of his stars, his gesture giving the finger and making the sign of the cross at once. His grin became a soft chuckle that shook his chest and made rings in the water. Julia laughed too. Her hands floated up to his shoulders and slid smoothly over the soapy skin to meet in the wet hair on the back of his head. They stopped laughing, but both still smiled. She leaned close and drew him toward her until her forehead pressed against his, their noses squashed together, their eyelids touching and tickling, a close-up blur of shadow and light. He had an urge to ease her lover's wasted body down under the water, hold him there until he drowned in a final baptism. Their eyes met, and Julia knew Avery saw what she imagined. Something, a sly smile, a twitch of irony flickered across his face. Their lips met, just touched, as they kissed each other for the last time. Every shared action, moment by moment, Julia wondered if they were doing this, whatever it was, for the last time together. I'll conclude with one more excerpt from a story called The Wrong Corner of the Sky. This story was originally published in Shenandoah Magazine as Late Night, Early Morning, and that became the title of my new and selected book of stories. To remember a former student and dear friend, Jean Libby, who got her MFA at the University of Alabama and who went on to become the first Southern and the first female editor of the prestigious literary magazine, the Southern Review, I took the new title from this sentence of Jean's that I now use as an epigraph for my story. And I quote, "He was sure he felt the sun setting low in the wrong corner of the sky," end quote. And my story's narrator, Paul, is experiencing middle-aged angst. He and his wife have had an argument. He does not understand his adolescent son, and Paul is suffering self-doubt. This excerpt comes near the end of The Wrong Corner of the Sky. Paul glanced at the front page. Israeli commandos had captured a suicide bomber before he detonated himself. A family of 3 died in a Detroit house fire. The president passed his annual physical with an A. On the other side of town, a woman had wakened to find a bear in her bedroom. The bear had come in through the screen door and was eating hand lotion from a tube on her dressing table. She crawled under the bed and waited terrified until she heard the bear go into her kitchen and start banging around in her pantry. She slipped from under the bed, got her cordless phone, got back under the bed, and called 911. The police came and shot the bear with a tranquilizer. The woman had made several pies for a church bake sale, and the police speculated the bear smelled the pies through the screen door and walked right through it. An expert at the university said it is highly unlikely that a brown bear would go inside a home. Wildlife authorities had driven the bear far up into the mountains to release him. Everyone said this woman put a human face on courage. In the shower, Paul turned the water as hot as he could stand it and let it beat on the back of his neck. He wondered how it was courageous for that woman to hide under her bed. At work, Paul didn't have much to say, but no one seemed to notice. He spent the afternoon looking over some precedents, not really reading them, but letting his eyes move over the words. He stayed in the office until late enough for rush hour traffic to die down. The sun hadn't set yet, but he turned on his car lights so he could enjoy the green glow of his dashboard. Instead of taking the expressway west toward home, he headed north toward the neighborhood where the bear had come into the woman's bedroom. The newspaper article had given the name of her street, but not her address, and he drove slowly down the street for several blocks until he saw a ripped screen door leaned against the front of a house. He parked and walked up the long sidewalk to the door. Though he knew the bear had been taken away, he watched for it anyway in the sunset shadows of trees and shrubs. He could not find a doorbell, so he knocked. He knocked and waited, knocked again. He wanted to ask the woman what it had been like the moment she opened her eyes and saw a bear at her dressing table. Had the big animal stood before the mirror on two legs, or had it sat at her dressing table? Had the big animal stood before the mirror, or was there any lotion left in the plastic tube the bear had bitten into? Were the holes from its teeth as big as the woman's fingers? Did that lotion smell good enough to eat? If the woman would let him, Paul thought he would like to taste that hand lotion. Would she think that was crazy? She came from between two holly bushes on the far side of the house and took a few steps onto the grass, but stopped while she was still a good 10 or 12 feet from him. You want to tell me what you're doing? Knocking. I'm just knocking. Paul still faced the door, and he had to look over his shoulder to see the woman. He felt as guilty as if he'd been caught trying to break in. They're not home. You're not her? I'm not who? The woman, who looked around as if she were expecting someone to step out of the bushes behind her, someone or something. The woman who found the bear in her room. Steve took her to New Orleans. You a friend of theirs? New Orleans? To get away from bear nightmares and bear ghosts. I've never met them. I read about it in the paper. The reverse of Goldilocks, the bear in the human's house instead of her in the bear's house. The woman did not smile, but he kept talking. Do you know how long it took them to come shoot it? I wanted to ask, I don't know, what it was like lying there with the bear that close. The woman pursed her lips and made one hand into a fist. She opened her mouth to say something, then just shook her head. She turned away and disappeared into the darkness gathering around the shrubs and under the eaves of the house. She was out of sight, but her voice rose from the shadows. Some people need to get a life. I'm sorry, Paul said to the yard and the bushes and the looming black roof. I didn't mean to disturb you. And he was sorry. She was right in a way. He had a life, but he didn't have the one he had planned on. Did anyone? The newspaper article never mentioned Steve, never mentioned the woman had a husband. Where were you, Steve, when the bear broke in? I hope these 4 excerpts give you some sense of the stories in my most recent book, Late Night, Early Morning. Donnie did a pastel painting that the publisher used for the cover. So I can proudly say, if you do get a copy, please judge this book by its cover. I'm going to wrap up my remarks by citing brilliantly crazy Ezra Pound, who wisely advises writers, and I quote, pay no attention to the prizes. That's good advice that I intend to blatantly disregard tonight as I pay attention to the Capote Prize that I accept with sincere gratitude. Thank you. Yeah. So, Alicia, Don, are there to be questions from the audience or not? How does that work?
There are. Don, I think Don just got unmuted. So
Can you hear me now?
yes.
Good. Did you collect any questions along the way?
No, there were no questions in the chat. So
All right. Let me get us started then. I've known Alan for a long time, and one of the things that all of his friends know is that he loves to tell jokes. He will always at lunch or drinks sit down and he'll have a joke or two, and he has a sense of humor. But if it hadn't been for the bear, we all would not have known that tonight. So my first question here is, what do you think of as the relationship between yourself and writing comic fiction or humorous fiction? By percentage, you don't. Many of your characters are in some sort of unhappy condition, but you can when you want to. Do you find it difficult? Do you like it? Do you avoid it? Do you seek it? Do you try and fail? What is the relationship between your writing and comic writing, if that's a way to put it? Because the bear story is funny.
And that's why I wanted to end on it. You know, I thought after cancer and finding dead babies, needed to show that there's a little bit of levity also in the story. You know, I had a student once who was struggling with a story. He's a graduate student at the University of Tennessee. And I gave him Caroline Gordon's short story. Trying to remember the title of it. It's something like An Afternoon. It's a story in which a man is going hunting, and he realizes, because he's got a bad leg, this is going to be his last time hunting. His name is Alex, and it's very clear from little subtleties in the story that he's something kind of rare in literature. He's an altogether decent man. You know, he knows that it's going to be cold when they return, and he goes and gets straw early in the morning, planning ahead for the dogs that'll be tired, so they'll have the straw to lie on, you know, after the hunt. And it's a beautifully paced story. The middle of the story is roughly the middle of the day in the hunt, and they stop to have lunch, and the pacing of it is lovely. And there's a sense of cycles. He's passing on to the boy what he's learned, you know, and that's another indication of his passing, of his going out. All the little details in the story, like he looks at the elderberry bushes that are growing and the frost is coming, and he says, "It'll get you yet." And of course, he's speaking to himself, not just to those bushes, right? Well, my student came back and I said, "Well, was that story helpful?" And he said, I didn't finish reading it. And I said, "Why not?" And I'm thinking, damn, I go to the trouble, find a story for you to read, you know, at least finish reading the story. And he said, I'm opposed to hunting. And I find hunting rather boring, you know. So, and I said, you've fallen for the domination of subject matter, which has not much to do with the story. The story isn't about hunting, it's about fatality. She just uses hunting as a way of getting there. And I said, you know, it's a matter of what interests you. It's not just the subject matter, but it's the language and the use to which she puts the hunting. And so I browbeat him into finally reading the story with a more open mind. And at least he claimed that the light bulb came on over his head and that it helped him with the story. This might seem a tangential way to respond to that question, but the line, you know, what interests you comes to mind to me. Is it subject matter alone, or is it the uses to which the writer, you know, puts the material? I think there are many comical moments in the stories, but I'm not sure that the reader is always, they're not laugh out loud kind of comical moments. But there are moments of irony and wit and, you know, that sort of thing.
Right.
I greatly admire George Singleton, who can tell dark, hilarious stories using our popular culture and make us look askance at it again. So I guess about as raucous as I generally get is that line in the bear scene. A university expert has said it is highly unlikely that a brown bear would. Well, the brown bear has already entered the house, but the expert says this could not have happened. And this just strikes me as a laughable example of, you know, education versus intelligence.
It could very well have been that the professor was a theorist, because reality did not match up
Exactly
with his theory.
Yes.
And I think it's Last Day in the Field, perhaps.
Yes. Yeah.
The story.
That's the story.
And Singleton is the funniest person alive, perhaps.
Yes.
He can't help it. I want to go in a slightly different direction. I saw in an interview that you did that you're now writing something like memoir, something that would be of a nonfiction memoirish variety.
Right.
And you have said in the beginning, at the start of your remarks, that what the fiction writer does is to move and select and change and alter, and that the fiction writer is certainly not indebted or beholden to the facts of the matter.
Right.
A lot of people writing memoir feel that way too, that they're not necessarily stuck with what really happened.
Right.
You are now in the process of writing some autobiographical material. Can you talk about what it is, and also how you think of yourself as going about it?
Yeah, and this has intrigued me in lots of other ways. When I started writing Tejano, I had won this fellowship to live on the Paisano Ranch west of Austin, Texas, and it's administered by the University of Texas and the Texas Institute of Letters. So basically, you've got 390 acres, 20 minutes to a paved road, but Austin is encroaching. You know, it used to be much more wilderness, and now they're building fancy homes near the ranch. And so there's threats on the retreat that writers get to spend 6 months there. Well, when we got there, I thought, this is the perfect place for me to write a cowboy novel. And that was the term I used, not a Western, a cowboy novel. I pictured writing a fun shoot 'em up that I could finish in about 6 weeks, you know? And I looked forward to writing a description of my brave old Comanche warrior in a long feather headdress. Because sadly, most of my knowledge and imagery of Native Americans came either from family stories or worse, from Hollywood. But I got me into Austin, to the Barker Library of Texana, where there's, you know, a white glove kind of library. You're looking at original manuscripts. And it was an eye-opening experience. First thing I learned was Comanches didn't have chiefs like other tribes did. They would have an orator, you know, he would be an orator chief, and they'd have someone would propose a raid, and if the raid went well and he divided the loot, then he might be a chief for another raid. But if a raid went badly, he was not going to get another raid and be a chief. It was an ongoing kind of thing. Well, that kind of nixed my wise old Comanche chief. And then I read that the average lifespan was the early to mid 30s, when they would just go off by themselves to die so they wouldn't become a burden on the rest of the tribe. They were nomadic. And I thought, well, at least I can describe this headdress. Well, not so, because they didn't wear feather headdresses until the late 19th century, when they went to meetings and saw other Plains Indians wear them. Then they went home and had the squaws do some knockoff headdresses to copy the ones they had seen. But what I learned they wore were the hollowed out actual heads of buffaloes that they would put over their own heads. And I thought, hell, as a fiction writer, I can live with that, but it taught me how seductive research and the facts may be. You've learned something and you kind of want to show off that you know this. And of course, that's the tail wagging the dog, in a novel. So I wanted to write a fiction that had some fidelity to the facts, but gave me the freedom still to interpret things and invent things. I realized that when I was going to avoid the Civil War entirely. And so I set the novel in a brief window after the Civil War, when the Comanches kind of flamed back to life before they were inevitably snuffed out. I could not have my characters walking around totally ignorant of this conflagration that had consumed the nation for 4 years. So eventually I relented and actually developed, I mentioned the twin brothers who fight on opposite sides. The number of characters kept growing as the research informed the book, and it kept, taking longer and longer. And the humor was where I found it, sort of. I was surprised that profanity was very common among women and children at that time on the frontier. Deadwood may not be so far off, the TV series. Things that we didn't expect. And so I tried to use the surprise of some of those things to create a kind of ironic humor based on our expectations or my expectations about this, what this was really gonna be like. I adored reading George Singleton's works. I recently sent him an email. I saw this piece about a horrendous obituary written by the family about how horrible the grandmother was and how glad they were she was dead. And I said, George, you may get tired of this, but this seems like a ready-made Singleton story somehow. And it turned out, he said, I have just published a story about a horrible negative obituary. So such an odd dovetail that you would send me that. So I don't know that I'm really answering the question. I think there are in the stories, and perhaps more in the novels, because of what I said earlier about digressions for their own sake, jokes and humor. It may a little bit be in the eye of the beholder, but I certainly think the man wanting to taste that lotion and wondering if the bear sat on it or stood, to me, that's comical, but it's also got a little bit of poignancy about it. And in a way, I can understand the question, and even he's self-conscious about it, to think, can I ask her to taste the lotion, or is she going to think that's crazy? And it is crazy, but on the other hand, it seems to me absolutely natural. You're putting yourself in the position of that and wondering, So I'm always pleased, and in some of the comments you mentioned, because Late Night, Early Morning is a new and selected volume, I didn't want to call it a new and selected volume. I just wanted to present it as a gathering of stories. And initially, the publisher, Scott Danforth, the head of Tennessee Press, he came to me and said, we want to do a book of yours. And he thought about doing a 10th anniversary edition of Tejano, but he said the length of the book for University Press, he said, we'd have to charge $25 a copy or something, because how many pages it is. So I said, well, how about a new and selected collection of stories? And it evolved. He said, I'd like to call attention to this as a culmination, not the end, but a gathering of what you've done in the forum up to this point, and get as many comments from other writers as possible. So he asked me to contact people who might be willing to write blurbs. I felt a mixed feeling, kind of embarrassment of riches and honored that there's 4 pages of blurbs before that book, from writers I admire who took the time, to read it. Many of them mention that the stories are laugh out funny in very many places. Moments of humor, not funny stories, but comical moments of maybe irony is better, just noticing the absurdity of the university professor who says after the fact, a bear wouldn't do that, but a bear's already done it, this kind of thing strikes me as
Alicia, you got any questions there?
What?
No, so you go ahead, Don.
I got a question.
Great.
May I ask it?
Yes,
Sure.
please.
Okay. Alan, first of all, not every writer reads their stories well, and your reading voice and the cadence of it fits the story so well, and it's so beautiful. What I heard, Tejano, you read it, which made me go out instantly and buy the book and read all 748 pages. But what I'm wondering is, as you write, how important is your ear to it, to the text as you're writing?
Not too much in the first draft, but very much so. I remember talking to William Gass about his work on the tunnel, which he spent 13 years or 19 years working on. And he said he could not advocate his method of writing, but that he didn't get to choose it. And he said, every day I have to rewrite the words leading up to the scene where I'd left it the day before. I can't just follow the story. The prose has to carry me into it in some way, right? So the importance, when I was a kid, another little quick anecdote, I guess, we were in Mexico City. My dad was investigating Veracruz, looking for ferns and flowers and having adventures. And my mother was a, contradictory as this sounds, an open-minded Southern Baptist who insisted that we take me to Mass in the big cathedral. And in those days, Roman Catholic Mass was still in Latin. The change hadn't taken place. And we went in and we listened to the sermon, and I'm 5 years old, I guess. She had taught me how to read and write. And we went to Sanborn's Cafe, kind of a touristy place where you could go on Sunday and eat, Mexican food, which wasn't really, it was a mix between interior Mexican and border Mexican. We're sitting there and Dad's making jokes about priests wearing skirts and offering me sips of his beer. And my mother's leaning over saying, what did that homily symbolize? And I said, Mother, it was in Latin. I don't understand Latin. And my mother's answer to that was, you weren't listening closely enough. So next Sunday, we got to go back, and I know the weight is on me to listen more closely, but I'm not quite sure what this means. And we get there, and because I knew I felt I was being tested, I paid more attention to the surroundings, and I noticed more fully there's amazing stained glass in this place, and it's set up so that if you follow the light on a normal day through the stained glass, it's like the setting of the sun as the lights change. Beautiful cathedral, votive candles dancing. And for the first time, I was moved by the holy hush of the experience, the atmosphere, I can't say that the priest's Latin miraculously entered my ears as English and I understood it, but that was one of the very first times. I mentioned Capote showing me that about leaving out voices in a Christmas memory name, this was the first time I realized I was moved by that homily in the way I had not been the week earlier when we went. I still didn't understand the Latin, but I took in the atmosphere and I appreciated in a real primitive way, the rhythms, the chants, the sounds of Latin, so that the way of saying became as important as the meaning that I couldn't understand. And at the time, of course, I didn't say cha-ching, I've learned something about writing. But there was a time later when I remembered that and thought, that's one of the very first times I acknowledged that it's not just the things said, but the way of saying is part of the experience. You know? Well, where we started, I sort of lost the track, but what was the initial question that I've digressed from?
Oh, I just said, how are you?
That's all it takes.
No, I was asking about as you write, do you hear the rhythms?
Right. Yeah. And they're very much, now I was not a writer at the time, but in my retelling, and my mother gives a pretty stern look, you know, I'm performing when I'm answering her. I'm self-conscious about what I'm doing. And I realized I had had an emotional experience based on a language I did not understand in an atmosphere that I was moved by. And it was an early lesson, I think, in ways that fiction can work, that gesture, detail, description, atmosphere, tone of voice, all of that is as important as some message. I mean, I think people who don't write fiction sometimes have the notion that a writer sets down to prove the ways of God to man. But if you begin with the theme, you've got the cart before the horse. And I was struck after my first collection of stories was published. I say stories because you've got so many different opportunities for interpretation. When I read reviews, I've never sat down writing a story saying, I want to write about the lonely, unrealized lives of isolated people or anything. But reading a reviewer pointing out connections, you write stories over a period of time, unless you're writing a linked collection where you're aware of it as a piece. You know, it's later when you put it together that you look for the connections. And so for the first time, I was learning what I was writing about. You know, and when a really good critic uses phrases like lonely, unrealized lives, I said, damn, that sounds good. I'm going to take credit for that. And so that began my appreciation of taking credit for unpremeditated art. You know, I did it. you drop worms in paint and put them on a canvas and they wiggle around and make a painting. You had the idea, so by God, it's your art, you know. But I think writers are least interested in theme and meaning, because you can't write a story that doesn't reflect your vision of the world. You choose 3 details out of 5. 2 different writers would choose the different 3 details based on their vision. So it's through those little details that we shape the meaning or the vision of the story after the fact. And writers, I think, are the least interested in theme or meaning and the most interested in imagery, language, texture. And that may be one distinction between fiction and creative nonfiction. There's a guiding principle generally to an essay or a piece of creative nonfiction, but you discover the guiding principle of a story or a novel as you write it. I like to say that the reader and the writer of a story are in much the same state, somewhere between sleeping and dreaming. When I was a kid, my dad and I went once a week to a little barber shop. And he had the older man, and I had the young guy, Wade, who was coon-ass from South Louisiana with a thick accent. And I loved it because they had Police Gazette and other questionable journals that Daddy didn't pay attention, and I could look around and pull out Police Gazette and see, you know, scantily clad women and murder scenes and stuff like that. And my dad was a little irritated with me being a bookworm. And I drew pictures and was always being invited to go to art schools. Daddy would always nix this. He didn't want to have a son who was a queer. And I don't mean to, in saying that, to suggest my dad was, you know, had disregard for differences. He was a very open-minded guy, but he was a man of World War II and of the values of the time. And he was a lot happier if I was out playing ball than spending days in my room reading or writing, you know, whatever, drawing. But for the first time, he was proud of my bookwormness, because he said, "You bet Wade, my barber," he said, "I'll bet you can't get Alan's attention once he's in the magazine that it's his time to get in the chair without physically touching him and so on." And Wade took the bet. So he popped the apron they put on you, and I'm in Police Gazette, you know. He took the strap at the razor and slapped it, and he jiggled the glasses in the sterilizing liquid glass, you know. Nothing. I'm lost in the world. And finally, he had to lean over and shake me on the shoulder and say, "Son, it's time to get in the chair." And then grumpily, he reaches in and gives my dad the $5 to cover both of our haircuts. And so we left, and Daddy says, "Well, I'll be goddamned. That reading finally paid off." So we
Alicia, how are we doing?
Sorry, I had to unmute. We can still go for a few minutes if you have one more question.
There was a question printed out, I saw a moment ago, from Marianne Weber, was it?
Yes. Marianne, would you like to ask your question, or want me to read it? All right. Capote said,
I've got it unmuted. I did quite a bit of research for my book on Truman Capote's Southern years, and I was impressed with the numerous little just sayings that he would come up with. And he said, I think the one that impressed me the most was when he said, "I have chained myself to a merciless master." And since you have spent a lifetime writing, do you sometimes feel that about yourself?
No, I feel pretty lucky to have gotten paid by universities to stand in between students and works of literature. And my obligation, it seems to me, is to make myself obsolete as soon as possible. I've been very fortunate to teach in some real good MFA and PhD graduate programs where the fiction writers were already accomplished when they got there. And many of them have been successful. A lot of former students have published books. They are always sweet and grateful, you know, and acknowledge you in various ways. But I just was lucky to be standing at the shoulders of a lot of good writers who would have learned their craft on their own. One thing that can happen in a good creative writing workshop, particularly at the higher levels, when you don't have to spend time talking about craft and technique, you're working with people who already understand that. You can talk about more interesting or complicated things. Is that if I've learned something as a writer who's older, written more, published more, and my student trusts me when I say, for example, don't use descriptive dialogue tags, just use he said, she said, because you can't really hiss words. You can't, "Oh my gosh, she hissed," is really inaccurate. It calls attention to the artificiality of dialogue. But if you simply say when any assignation is needed, he said, she said, disappears on the page. We don't notice it, and it lets it seem more like natural dialogue. Now, you could bring a list of great writers who've used descriptive dialogue tags. I acknowledge that. But I think generally speaking, it's more effective to use as few dialogue tags as possible and keep it down to said. If a writer believes me, says, yeah, that makes sense, then I've saved her a lot of trial and error to discover that on her own. And that's repeated in all kinds of technical ways. You know, you don't ever teach a good writer anything she or he wouldn't learn on their own, but sometimes, and it's been passed down. Some other writer told me this in a way that I believed it made sense. And you learn some anecdotes. You can say, here's an example, you know, and that helps make it more convincing. So to me, it has felt more like a I've got a writer friend who said when his son was a toddler, he was sitting at the typewriter and the boy toddled over and grabbed his leg and said, hey, Daddy. And, you know, he's in the midst of working and slightly exasperated. He says, no, Blake, leave Daddy alone. Daddy's working. And he said he sat and watched this little boy kind of sadly walk away, and he felt terrible. And he said, wait a minute, come here, Blake. He called him back and he put his arms around him and he says, Daddy's not working, Daddy's playing. Interrupt me all you want to. So there aren't very many occupations that you can live as holistically as that, I think.
True.
So I said once that the dean of any university isn't any harder to please than the Duke would have been at an earlier time with a different kind of patronage, you know. So a lot is written about the pros and cons of creative writing programs. That the cons are easy and obvious to see, but easy and obvious to avoid. I've had a couple of students come into workshops in which I could realize this is not a person who's going to benefit from peer review. Something about her personality, and she's doing things that aren't going to be easily understood and interpreted by other writers who are at a similar state of development that she's at. So I've sent writers like that. I said, don't come to class. I found the cabin for one in Virginia at Hollins College, and I said, when we're meeting, you spend 3 hours in this cabin and work, and then you bring me your work 3 times a semester. I gave her an A for the semester of taking that workshop. She didn't take the workshop. She went and worked on her own. I think that was the better thing for her to do, and that she would have made it less effective for other students in the class because of her different attitudes about it. And I think she was ready and capable to do work on her own, you know. And I think most writing programs allow for that kind of flexibility because they know you're dealing with artists and it's not, everyone doesn't progress in the same way. So the teaching side of it has usually fed my work. I learn things from students all the time. I can't imagine teaching writing and feeling condescending to students, even undergraduate, because you never know who's going to surprise you with some insight in class. Now, I don't mean to sound holy. There are days with stacks of rough drafts of student stories, and I look at them and think, am I really excited about reading these 30 manuscripts and making comments and taking the time? You know, not always, but always when I have made myself fulfill my obligation to do that, there have always been surprises that made it worthwhile. You know, you pull a story by someone that you thought was quietly sitting in the corner, angrily not paying attention or not getting with the program or whatever, and then you see something she's done to prove that she heard something. It doesn't mean it's finished. Or you see people making the kinds of mistakes that are good mistakes to make. Like, generally speaking, I think overwriting is a good mistake because it means here's a writer who cares enough about language to overdo it, to describe things maybe too well. It's very easy. It's much easier to show someone how to cut down on excesses than to take someone who writes stark prose that doesn't have any texture or richness and try to show them how to pump it up. So, you know, you look for the strengths in the weaknesses of some of the work that actually augur good things for the future. A writer who doesn't love literature isn't going to be flowery. So flowery writing may be a good thing. That's pretty easy to nip in the bud and shape. And it's just important to look within each manuscript for the notion of how to read that particular manuscript. And to
Alan,
teach students.
Alan, during all the many years that I was teaching, I wish it had occurred to me to ask a number of students to go and sit in a cabin in the woods instead of actually being in the class where I was. I think that would have smoothed things out quite a lot.
Yeah, and I will admit, some of the time it was getting a disruptive person out of the group, but because it wasn't doing either one any good to be in that particular group.
Every once in a while.
I did this at Hollins College, which is a small private school. Things are a lot looser. You have to accommodate the kind of institution that you're at and what you can do and what you can't do, of course.
Right. I think perhaps, besides thank you, one of the things that I might add just to here right at the end is that your student, our friend Tim Parrish, has done a little bit of investigating and believes that your students have, as of now, published over 100 novels. And that is a lot of novels. So whatever it is you're doing it just fine. Alicia, we've come to the end of our time, have we not? Where are you?
Yeah.
And I thank you very much, Alan, and I'm looking forward to next spring in Monroeville when you'll be there and we'll all be there and we can all hear you speak again and we can all eat and drink. Thank you. Alicia?
I appreciate getting to go physically and speak in that course.